Okay, hi guys. How many views do I have? None yet. Hi guys. Is the audio working? Okay, cool. I guess we'll get started then. Okay, so I'm Jasmine, your VP for devices, and I will be presenting helicopters today. So just for a basic description of the event, this is taken straight from the parameters. So prior to the tournament, teams design, construct, and test free flight helicopters to achieve maximum time aloft. So before the competition, you're going to have to prepare 2 or more helicopters, and when the parameters say 2 or more helicopters, they mean more than 2 helicopters, just in case. A flight log, and we'll go over this in more detail later because they do have rules for that, and you're going to have to turn it into the proctors. Any necessary tools you'll need to fly the helicopters, so this includes like winders or extra materials in case your helicopter breaks, anything else. And then at the competition, to give you an idea of what the competition itself will look like, it'll be indoors. It's usually in the gym of wherever you're doing the competition. So for regionals, for example, if it's San Jose State, it'll be the gym there. And you'll have 8 minutes for 2 flights, and the proctors take the best time of the 2 flights, and they start timing the 8 minutes, not the time for your flight, but the 8 minutes you have to fly the helicopters once you begin preparing for the first flight, and they'll stop the timer when you release the helicopter for the second time. Okay, now let's talk about the helicopter itself. So there are several components to the helicopter, and this is what it's going to look like somewhat, and there might be some differences like the number of rotors or the length of the motor stick, but this is the general structure, and this is the most common structure with 2 rotors. So this is your helicopter, your baby. You're going to protect it with your life. Don't step on it. This is the rubber motors that you're going to be using to power the helicopter. So basically, you'll be cutting, it's like a really long rubber band, like noodles, and then you'll cut it into certain lengths and tie it together to form like a very large rubber band. And then one end of the rubber band will be attached to the motor stick, which is this horizontal stick you see in the middle, and the other end will be attached to the top rotor. Usually it's the top rotor that turns, and the bottom rotor is affixed to the motor stick, so it won't, when the motor stick turns, this turns, and the top rotor is loose. So basically what you'll do is you'll wind the rubber, you'll like twist it around, which will cause a lot of torque on the rubber, which will then cause the top rotor to turn, which powers your helicopter. Okay, and these are some extra rotors in this picture, and all the solid balsa wood that you see here, these are fixtures to help protect your helicopter. So they don't actually serve any purpose with the flight, but a lot of people do this because balsa wood is very fragile. Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. Just a second. So back to the presentation. Right, so the fixtures, they might be a good idea to build, especially if you're clumsy, because the helicopters are very fragile. The balsa wood is very thin and very not dense, so even the smallest amount of pressure can cause it to break. And also the mylar, the plastic wrap you see here, it's very, very thin and very fragile, so you have to be very careful when handling it. And this is just another more comprehensive diagram of what the helicopter looks like. So as you can see here, it points to like all of the anatomies. So on the bottom left here, you can see the length of the rotor, the width of the rotor is called the chord. And the one of these like parallelograms is the rotor blade. And then the lines that are holding the rotor blade together, the balsa wood there, those are called the ribs. And the leading edge is the side of the rotor blade that cuts in the air first, and the trailing edge is behind the leading edge when the rotor is spinning. Okay, now on the top here, you see they have the rotor thrust bearing, the bushing, and the spinning motor hook. So basically the spinning motor hook is what attaches the rubber band motor to your top rotor. So basically when the rubber band unwinds, it'll turn this motor hook, which will in turn spin the rotor. And the rotor thrust bearing goes in between the motor stick and the spinning motor hook to prevent friction, and the bushing goes between the motor stick and the rotor to prevent friction. So this will maximize your flight. Sorry. And in the middle, you have the motor stick here. This one here, oh, it's lagging. This one here is a kind of unique motor stick. Usually, you'll just have a single stick that's a bit thicker than what you're using for the rotors. But this one is a double motor stick. So basically, there's two pieces of wood on the sides, and in the middle, you have the rubber band motor. And the good point of this double motor stick is that it prevents the rubber band from hitting the sides, but at the same time, it's a bit heavier than the single motor stick. And another option is a hollow tube motor stick, and this is much lighter than the other options, but the problem is that basically it's a piece of very thin balsa wood and it's rolled up, and you put the rubber motor in the middle. But the problem with this is that even though it's very light, it's hard to attach the rubber band to it, and it's hard to make. So most people will use a single or double motor stick. I have yet to see a hollow tube one. Okay, now for materials. So these are, you'll need a lot of various materials to build a helicopter. You might not necessarily use all of them, but most of these are for testing. So for balsa wood, you'll need 1/16 inch sticks for building the rotors, and you can see on the top right here, like the thinnest stick that's what I'm talking about. And there's also 1/16 inch thick sheets, which you'll use for other parts of the rotor. For example, like you can cut out shapes in order to support your helicopter, and you'll also need one of those for a disc that you have to attach to the top of the helicopter. And then Mylar is basically this very thin plastic wrap. So think saran wrap, but way, way thinner. It says 2 to 4 micrometers thick, meaning it's 2 to 4 thousandths of a millimeter thick. So it's very fragile and very light, which is why we use this material. And generally when building the helicopter, people will also like crumple up the Mylar before using it in order to get more surface area, because more surface area means more lift. Okay, and you also need the rubber bands, like I was talking about earlier, basically like this long noodle of a rubber band. And most people probably will use 1/16 inch rubber bands or 1/32 inch, but it would be a good idea to buy a bunch of varying thicknesses, because the thicker rubber bands versus thinner rubber bands, each of them have their own pros and cons. So thicker rubber bands are more powerful, but you can wind them less, while thinner rubber bands you can wind more, so they might get more turns, but there will be more turns on them at the end of the flight because they're not that powerful. So that's a good thing to experiment with. And for other materials, you might need carbon filaments, or piano wire. Basically, these are for making the motor hook that you'll use to attach your rotor to the rubber band motor. And O-rings are used to tie onto the rubber band motor to attach so that the rubber band motor is attached indirectly to your helicopter. And not all people use this, but it's a good idea to use it because it prevents the rubber band from breaking as easily. Because when you wind it too much, breaking the rubber band will be a huge issue. Another thing is the rotor thrust bearings, which, as I said earlier in the diagram, it prevents friction, and the bushing does the same purpose. And then the motor hook, you'll need a stationary motor hook for the motor stick to attach the rubber band to. Okay, now for testing. When you record, you'll need to record flights in a flight log for the competition, and in the parameters it says that you need 6 or more variables for this flight log and 10 or more flights. And for these 6 variables, you must include the motor size before windup, the number of turns on the motor, the flight time, and 3 or more additional variables. And these can include anything from like motor width, angle of rotor wings, length of motor stick, anything like that. And not all of these necessarily have to change. For example, you might use the same length for the motor, and you can just have like a constant, like let's say it's 11 inches. You have to have 11 inches all the way down your log. That's fine. Just make sure that you have 6 or more variables, because the judges will dock you points for that. And then you'll need to find a testing place, and this could be, depending on your connections and resources, this can be the hardest part of this event. You'll need a place with a high flat ceiling. A lot of times people will use gyms, but like the Monte Vista gym is hard to get. So when I did it, I just tested it in my house, which was not good, but it had a flat ceiling. So a flat ceiling, it takes priority over a high ceiling, because if it's not flat, the helicopter can get stuck. And keep in mind that at the competition, the conditions won't be perfect either, because the ceiling probably will have like pipes and air conditioning. So when you build a helicopter, you want to make sure it doesn't like move around too much while it's on the ceiling, because that increases the chances of it getting stuck. Okay, and then things to test, basically like the variables that you want to change. You can do this with any of the variables, but the most common ones that you would do this with are the number of winds on the rubber motor. Usually people will want to get the maximum number of winds, but this can be difficult because the rubber will break after a certain number. Usually, like, if you pass like 1,000 or 2,000 winds, it'll break. So you have to test this at home to see how many winds your rubber motor can take at different lengths and thicknesses. And then another thing you'll vary is the thickness of the rubber motor. So, like I said earlier, there are pros and cons to each of the different thicknesses. You might want to like play around with that to see which one works for your helicopter better. And then the rotor pitch. So basically, a pitch is like another word for the angle. So depending on your helicopter angle, it'll go up and down faster or slower. So a higher angle will need a stronger motor, more torque in order to make the helicopter turn. but it will also make the helicopter go higher when it turns. Whereas a smaller pitch or like a smaller angle of the helicopter wing, it'll take less power to get the rotor to turn, but it won't be as powerful in moving the helicopter up. So this is something you will most likely want to test on your helicopter, unless you get it right on the first try. And also when you're winding the rubber band, you have to wind very carefully. So the technique for this usually is you'll have like a yellow plastic rubber band winder that you can find at various websites, and each time you crank the handle, it'll turn the rubber band like 10 or 15 turns. So each time you fly the helicopter, you have to record how many turns you're doing. And when you're winding, usually you should stretch the rubber band out like as long as you can without like it risking it breaking in order to make it looser. And then you'll start winding very far out with the rubber band stretched a lot. And as you wind more and more, you should get closer to the other end of the rubber band. So when you're winding it, the rubber motor should get shorter and shorter because that will prevent it from breaking. Another thing you want to do is lubricate your rubber. So there are a lot of different things you can use to lubricate it. You can use soft soap is what I used last year for Right Stuff, which is like the previous helicopter event, which was not really helicopters. Other people also use Armor All, which is like a kind of polish for cars. You can search these up, but like the lubricant is important to have. It's not as important on what lubricant you use, but basically it prevents the rubber band from breaking. Okay, so for the parameters on the helicopter itself, this is just taken from the parameters which you can find in the resource portal. So you have to build the helicopter from scratch or from a kit, and you cannot have any pre-glued joints or pre-covered surfaces. Basically, you can't have someone build your helicopter for you. You can use any materials for your helicopters but boron filaments, and most people won't use this, but the reason they put this is because boron is lighter than carbon, and it can give you an advantage, but they're also rare and very expensive, so you probably wouldn't want to use them anyways. For the size, the helicopter must be 2.5 grams or more without the rubber motor. So they do this because you can't have your helicopter too light, or else that'll give you a huge advantage on how long your helicopter flies for. So generally you're going to try to go as close to 2.5 grams as possible, maybe like 2.55 or 2.6 grams. Give a little bit of a margin to be safe, and make sure to weigh it before going to the competition to make sure that the mass is within the parameters. You can have up to 3 rotors, and a rotor is like a set of blades. So in the example earlier, one rotor had 2 blades, and there were 2 rotors on the helicopter. So you can have up to 3 rotors. Usually people will use 2 rotors. No, you can't use 1 rotor, so it's 2 or 3 rotors. Any number of blades. Usually you'll see people use 2 or 3 blades. Very rarely people use single-bladed rotors because they're difficult to build, but they do have advantages. And the maximum diameter for the rotor is 20 centimeters. And for a single-bladed rotor, the maximum diameter is 12.5 centimeters. And your helicopter must be powered by removable rubber motors. So these are what I mentioned earlier, like the motors that you'll have to cut and tie together yourselves. And you have to have a flat balsa wood disc larger than a dime at the very top of your helicopter. So when you fly it, it must be the first thing to touch the ceiling. You can't have like the wings touch the ceiling, because this could be a problem. It might be hard to get the balsa wood disc to touch the ceiling first. And all these things, if you violate them, you will have huge consequences. So when you're building your helicopters, you have to take into account the parameters first, because it doesn't matter if you get 1 minute or 5 minutes on your helicopter. If you violate one of these and get put into the second tier, you'll be ranked behind everyone else. So like if someone doesn't violate any of these rules but has a 30-second flight, you'll be behind them if you have a 20-minute flight and you use boron filaments or something. So make sure not to violate these rules. Okay, and then these are just some links. This PowerPoint will be posted in the resource portal later, so you can use the Scioly, the wiki page. Basically, it's like student created, and there's a lot of good information on there for like building helicopters, because helicopters is not really a new event. It hasn't been done in the past few years, but there is previous information on it. And you can also use the official website, Soink. They have some resources for where you can get supplies and also some building tips. This third link is a place where you can get some resources. It's mainly for rubber because that's like the thing that you'll need a lot of, as well as balsa wood, which you can order online or buy at like hobby shops. I'll post a link to another hobby shop website here later. And then the last link is just some information on the physics of flight. It might be a good idea to like read through this or learn some of the physics related to helicopter building. Because the judges can ask you about your helicopter and how it works at the competition, and they can dock you points if like they think you're clueless. And also because it'll help you when you're testing your helicopter. So if something's going wrong and you don't know the physics behind it, it's very hard to make a change in order to improve it. But by knowing the physics, you can make it so that you can test your helicopters and build them better with a basic understanding of them. I'll open up to questions. This is at the beginning, so I'm going to start from the beginning. Okay, so how expensive are the parts? So balsa wood and rubber are not very expensive. Those are the two things you'll be using the most of. Rubber is maybe like, for the place I got them, it was 16 cents per 3-foot stick. So that might cost like maybe $10. But the most expensive things will be the mylar if you don't use it wisely, and the other parts like the rotor thrust bearings and hooks. But overall, this engineering event is, another question is this event an engineering event only, no written test? Yes, it is. There's no written test for this. So the parts, to answer your question on how expensive the parts are, it might cost around like $50 to $80 in total for the entire season. And you'll still have parts left over. I have parts left over from last year. And, but also, like, Science Olympic can reimburse you for this. Okay, more comments below. Yeah, okay. If no one has any more questions, or really on any other engineering event, because I'm the VP for devices, and